Oi, Simon! We going to that tower back there? Karlak asked, whistling to call Scratch to heel.
An immense arcane tower guarded by a boulette. Of course he wants to see inside. Not to speak for you, dear.
Astarion smirked, running a teasing hand down Simon's arm.
Sure to be packed full of arcane secrets and valuable treasures. I know I'm not the only one who wants to enter. Simon grinned.
It does look tighter than a patriarch's purse strings. Gotta be a safe place to catch a breather, Karlak remarked. Indeed. It's almost too perfect, Shadowheart frowned, her eyes scaling up the tower. It must either be heavily guarded, or be a trap in and of itself. Trust nothing in the Underdark. Indeed, the area seemed eerily quiet as they approached. Scorch marks on the ground here, Karlak said, gesturing to burned and blasted tiles. Tracing the trajectory, her eyes landed on a remarkable bit of sculpture in the middle of the courtyard. Gotta be more to that than meets the eye.
Indeed, Simon nodded, his eyes scanning the grounds. No sign of a place to deactivate any arcane sigils. Must be set to fire on sight.
Do you think we can destroy it at range? Worth a shot. Who wants to give it a go?
We don't know its maximum range yet, Astarion observed. Just because there's a scorch here doesn't mean that's the limit. All right, we've got some experimenting to do. Simon smiled, pulling his pack from his shoulder and digging for a bit of scrap paper in his quill. Let's get cracking, he said, the turn of phrase sounding less than natural coming from him.
Okay, so we've ruled out destruction and stealth. It's way more immune to magic than we are immune to it, Karlak groaned, rubbing in another shiny burn on her arm. Even after being healed up, the constant blasting was starting to accumulate. There's no other choice. We gotta find the controls inside. Gotta be there. Right. Get inside, shut it down, get everyone else inside, then have a bloody nap, Shadowheart sighed, buffing at a scorch on her armor as well. I don't know how much more experimenting I can handle.
All right, well, who's it going to be? Astarion asked, looking at the company he was keeping. Well, I think you would be best equipped, Simon began, gesturing to the rest of them. You're fastest, lightest, you know how to pick locks and disable traps. I think you know as well as we. We're not suited for a heist. You would have to go alone, though. If that's all right, Simon added with an apologetic tone. Trusting me with first pick of the spoils? Astarion smirked, his eyes alight. Astarion, I want you to pick up everything that isn't nailed down, Simon grinned.
And that doesn't kill you, Shadowheart added.
I should think that would go without saying, Simon said.
You'd think, but you'd be wrong, Karlak said, rubbing her wrists. The overlap between smart animals and stupid people is bigger than you'd think.
Isn't that right, Scratch? Who's a smarter boy than some of the devils in my platoon?
We should be able to distract the turret long enough for you to slip past, Shadowheart said, peering up the stairs leading to the front doors. Then it looks like one of the windows is broken. Easy entrance.
Then just find the control panel and whatever it's set to, switch it to the opposite setting, Simon added. Search for any orbs or crystals or sigils that might be necessary to unlock it, of course. You never know what might actually be a key when it comes to us wizards, he smiled with a hint of embarrassment for his cohort. Oh, and take this. Phone might be unstable, Simon said, rifling through the slightly squished scrolls in his pack until he pulled one out, nearly flattened. I really need to get a box for these, he sighed. In any case, use this once you get up there. It will keep you from, well, not from falling and not from hitting the ground, but it will keep you from falling as fast or hitting the ground as hard. Ah, I see. You really do care. Astarion sniffed, taking the scroll and tucking it into the space between his bracer and forearm. We'll be waiting here for you. Simon smiled, a twinge of discomfort roiling in his chest. After his conversations with everyone the day and night before, he'd been feeling quite self-conscious. He could hardly look at Astarion without shame blossoming on his cheeks. "Good luck," he said, forcing himself to smile through the embarrassment.
"We'll get as close as we can. Be ready to run as soon as they fire,"
Shadowheart said quietly, though she didn't look at Astarion as she spoke. It was almost as if she were coaching herself through what was about to happen. The two crept forward to the edge of the turret's range. Astarion waited, coiled like a cat, waiting for the blast. At Shadowheart's grunt, he dashed forward, the arcane machinery slowly cranking to follow him, but the blast wouldn't recharge for another 5 seconds, minimum. He could cross a lot of ground in 5 seconds. He slid for cover behind a crumbling piece of masonry, watching as the turret slowly began to turn back toward Shadowheart as it lost its target. Another dart once it blasted in her direction again, and he found himself ducking behind the pillars in front of a massive doorway. No lock. Wizards. Peering back down into the courtyard, he didn't see any bodies. "All clear?" he asked, touching his earring.
"Yes," Shadowheart panted. "That second round nearly ended me," she added, more fear and adrenaline in her voice than they'd come to expect from their sardonic cleric.
"Leave the rest to me, darling," he said, turning his attention to the broken window. The gaping hole towered nearly 10 feet over his head, and the twisted lead left in place suggested once grand stained glass. Astarion hopped onto the low sill and stepped over the jagged teeth of glass remaining in the fixture, boots crunching into the glass and dust as he dropped the few feet to the floor. The sound of arcane gears grinding to life greeted his ears, and he saw the movement in the dark just in time. 2 more turrets. Shit! He dove behind a pillar, the charged hum of a readied spell buzzing lightly in the air behind him. He couldn't risk putting his head out to look, not until it released. Astarion unsheathed his dagger and held it up, trying to catch as much of the room as possible in the reflection of the blade. It was the one time he was thankful he couldn't see himself in a reflection, as he scanned through the space his head would normally occupy. The far turret looked to be on the other side of some sort of glass chamber in the center of the room, and the closest one, well, it was close enough that he could smell the mana in the air. The blue crackle of pure energy was aimed directly at the spot to his left where he had just been. "Come on, think, think," he whispered, glancing around the space he found himself in. He could see another door about 10 feet away, but he'd have to cross open ground, possibly pick a lock, and he'd only have a few seconds. Worse still, he didn't hear this turret powering down yet. Must have had more power in reserve than the ones outside, constantly firing at kobolds and giant rats and adventurous drow. Patience. Wait it out. It felt like nearly a minute before he heard the hum of power drop in pitch and deactivate, and even then Astarion gave it another 30 seconds to confirm. He slowly stowed his dagger and instead pulled out his lockpicks. It'd be the quickest job he'd had to do in quite some time. Well, thinking back on it, ever since being thrown out of the Nautiloid, he'd had to do quite a few things for the first time in ages. It was all starting to run together somewhat. Focus. Astarion exhaled slowly and did not draw breath again. Quiet. Still as the grave. It might not help with the turrets, but who knew what else might be in this tower? And it would help to study his hands either way. He rose up onto his toes and sprang from his place, 2.5 paces to the door. He slid the lockpicks into place as the turret's gears whirred to life again, their grinding almost swallowing up the click of the lock opening under his expert touch. He tore the door open and slammed it shut behind him, eyes widening slightly as he felt a concussive blast strike the wood. Too close. Force of habit led him to sigh in relief, as if hearing the sound of himself would make him real. A quick glance around at the balcony he found himself on showed that it was now more mushroom than marble. Great blue lobes of fungus had overtaken the platform, but were easily large enough to walk on. Astarion tested his weight on one gingerly before stepping onto it and scrabbling slightly as it sagged under his weight, but managed to hold. Slowly, carefully, he slid from one broad cap to another until he came to rest on another, smaller balcony about a floor below. Bad news is, I found more turrets. Good news is, they haven't killed me yet, Astarion announced into his earring. That is good news, Karlak piped up in his ear, though lacking some of her usual energy. Keep at it, soldier. Astarion was already picking the next lock before she'd finished her encouragement, and he cautiously opened the door into another chamber filled with fungus. Everything had an eerie blue and orange glow in the bioluminescence, but nothing moved in response to his presence. A welcome turn of events in a place like this. There was yet another glass chamber in the center of the room, with a symbol on the floor resembling Gale's earring. Strange. Likely something arcane, but outside of Astarion's knowledge base. And regardless, Astarion did not want to step into a strange glass chamber of unknown use whilst alone inside an abandoned mushroom farm in the Underdark. Of all the things he thought he'd have to make a decision about today. Still, he had a mission, as it were. Pick up everything not nailed down, simple enough, and find whatever passed for keys in a wizard's tower. There didn't seem to be much here, unfortunately, save for a few shriveled mushrooms that had been picked in untold years past, and a heavily damaged book left on a shelf at about waist height. It must have been a handsome manuscript once, handwritten and detailed, but years of water damage, ink blots, and rat teeth had taken their toll. Only a few lines were still visible, apparently from a play based on their positioning on the page. How can I trust? How will I ever know? How can I show myself, my darkest me? I'm not normally one for literature, but there's something there, Astarion mused to himself, about to toss the remains of the book back on the shelf. It was just as likely the book itself would be a key, wasn't it? Sighing, he tucked the brittle pages back into the pack slung over his shoulder and readjusted it on his back. Search as he might, however, there were no stairs. No ladders, no ropes, not even a useful weak spot in the floor like Simon had warned him against. Against his better judgment, Astarion leaned into the glass chamber and peered about. There appeared to be a pair of buttons on the floor, with runes etched beneath each. Some sort of elevator, it would appear, with an absolutely terrible configuration for the operation controls. The space smelled of the arcane, but it was musty, covered up by various mushroom spores. Tapping his foot on the descend button yielded no reaction. What, the turrets get to stay active, but the lift is broken? What sort of operation were these wizards running here? He huffed, striding out of the chamber without even a hint of magical retaliation from the device. He would have to find another way. Carefully testing the latch on another oaken door, Astarion found himself on another small, terribly damaged balcony, looking down onto a garden of sorts, the tiles and benches long broken. But a courtyard meant a door. A door meant access. Just as long as there weren't any more bloody turrets. Something to break his fall would be nice, too, besides his neck. Perhaps one of those enormous mushrooms. They were only, 150 feet away? God's damn it. Astarion glanced down at his bracer, and with a grin he pulled the scroll from where he'd tucked it in his armor, half unrolling, half unfolding the parchment. The ink was deep blue and iridescent with magic, and he smirked as he found the instruction for incantation. Non fit injuria, he recited, his pronunciation more legalistic than arcane, but he could certainly feel the spell take hold. As the ink burned off the page and consumed the parchment, he felt a tiny bit of resistance to his feet meeting the ground, as if gravity weren't enough to hold him any longer. He took a few steps backwards before taking a leap over the edge. The sensation was strange, more like falling through water than air as he drifted down into the haunting little courtyard, his boots tapping harmlessly against the ground. The centerpiece of the courtyard on the lake was a captivatingly beautiful tree, its leaves glowing with a cold, crystalline blue light. The light cast the dark bark of the tree in silver, the deep grooves in the bark like black veins. He felt an odd pang of familiarity as he gazed up into its light, a little leap in his half-beating heart. It felt like starlight somehow, distant and unchanging, and stirred what was still elven in his soul. To see a spray of galactic elegance so deep beneath the surface was truly, literally breathtaking. Even with his chest, he felt as though he couldn't draw breath if he tried. He was so transfixed by its astral beauty. A few delicate, honey-sweet, orchid-like flowers bloomed beneath the shining boughs, and Astarion drew his dagger to gently pry one from its place. The light wasn't the only thing that was cold, it seemed. Even touching the silken, midnight blue petals felt like he was caressing ice. He carefully stowed his prize and turned back for the courtyard door. It all felt so reminiscent, somehow, of Simon and how he had described his dark god. He shook the thought from his mind, at least for the most part.
"Darling, I've found something you'll want to see," Astarion said, his slightly numbed fingers touching his earring. "A gorgeous little tree. Brings to mind some of the least stuffy elven poems. I'm sure you will recall a verse or two once you've seen it." He'd pulled out his lockpicks and was halfway through opening the door when the lack of reply hit him. "Darling? Simon? Are you there?" No response. His brows furrowed. "Shadowheart? Is everything all right?" The silence continued. "Shadowheart? Karlak? Respond, please." "Simon? Simon!" The bottom of his stomach dropped, the feeble motion of his heart ceasing. Silence like this only came when the other party was asleep, or... Oh no. No. No, no, no. His fingers flew and darted like dragonflies around his lockpicks, and as soon as he heard the click of the lock giving way, he threw his weight against the doors, ripping the picks from the lock. His wide eyes scanned the room, some sort of alchemical lab, it seemed, for stairs, doors, some sort of portal-making staff, anything that would get him back to the others. They were in trouble. They were hurt. They were dying. He was dying. There was another massive glass chamber in the center of the room, but this one was filled with some sort of arcane machinery, with brass tubes running through the walls of the chamber, into the floor, up through the ceiling, both inside and out of the glass. Whatever its purpose, it laid still and cold. It must be whatever drove the lift system. It had to be. If it wasn't... Astarion tore through the papers and books on the tables, but nothing seemed useful. Recipes for potions made from mushrooms, a book on botany, more goddamned poetry. Astarion shoved it all haphazardly into his pack. He'd been told to take everything that didn't kill him. Everything. "Do as thou art told, boy." He paused as he passed the front of the mechanism, the faint scent of honey catching him off guard. On the ground in front of the device, a few singed midnight blue petals were scattered on the floor. A sweet-smelling resin coated a small grate at the front. Astarion threw down his pack and raced back through the doorway, flying towards the tree again. Dagger in hand, he hacked haphazardly at the trunk, freeing another one of those cold, fiery flowers and scrambling back inside. He could swear his fingers were freezing over as he held it, bruising the silky, cool petals in his desperate grasp. "Gods, please, please, whoever will hear the prayer of the soulless, please don't let them be dead," he whispered, nearly crushing the flower into the grate and yanking his hand back as bright blue flames licked up, catching the petals like paper. Sweet smoke rose up like blessed incense into the chamber,
and a low arcane hum began to fill the air. Braziers jumped to life with blue flame. Threads of energy lit the sides of the brass piping running throughout the tower. But the moment of wonder was lost on Astarion. He seized his pack, throwing it back over his shoulder and looking around wildly. When his eyes lit on stairs, he raced forward, taking them 2 at a time. "Oh, Father Corellin, Dark Maiden, Mother of Magic!" He gasped the names of gods who had never listened to him before in over 200 years, his heart fluttering weakly in his chest as the last of the strength of Simon's last gift faded from his veins. "I ask not for myself, but for another. Please. Oh, Simon's nameless dark god, please. Please hear me. Spare your servant." Astarion threw himself into the glass chamber, the symbol on the floor now glowing with cold blue light, and slammed the button labeled Ascend. The floor remained unmoved. As Astarion looked around, eyes wide in terror, the chamber filled with a misty haze. Not a moment later it had cleared, and the room beyond was different. The fungus farm once more. And another button had appeared next to Astarion's hand, now a few centimeters above the button he had pressed. The new yet familiar button read, Descend. It worked. He slammed his fist into the Ascend button once again, barely able to see the room beyond changing through the veil of mist. As soon as it cleared, he smelled the scent of scorched wood and saw on either side of the chamber the arcane turrets, collapsed into an inactive state, the light gone from them. Astarion tore from the chamber and flung himself at the doors like a terrified animal, scrabbling for a moment before pulling back, the glint of arcane firelight against a shiny brass lever catching his eye through the fear. He threw the switch and the door swung open with grace. Grace Astarion did not share in the moment. He was nearly falling down the stairs in his rush, his feet barely able to keep up with his fear. Faster than he'd run to evade the turrets in the first place, he flew past their stilled, collapsed forms, past the front courtyard. In the darkness, he saw forms. 3 of them. "Hi, it's Astarion! Welcome back!" Karlak called, giving Scratch quick pats on the belly to avoid singeing his fur. You're all... That was fast. Simon laughed, hopping to his feet and jogging over. "Absolutely brilliant, as usual," he began. Though as soon as he got within a few meters, Simon looked as if he was going to be violently ill. The color in his face, wan that it was, drained almost in an instant, and he stumbled to his knees, gasping and clutching his chest. "Simon!" Shadowheart cried, rising from her spot beside Scratch and hurrying to his side. The soothing blue light of her spell fizzled out as she reached Simon's side, and she, too, gasped and stumbled, sinking to one knee. "What's happening? What?" Shadowheart gasped, clutching her chest. I can't feel. "Vitae extolo," Simon chanted, his voice shaking as if he'd been struck in the solar plexus. There wasn't the usual rumble of the weave being commanded, the anticipatory sensation of someone else vibrating the air in one's lungs that normally came with the casting of magic. Simon noticed before he'd even finished the incantation. "Tum vita est spes est, vitae extolo," he repeated with more intent in his voice, but no power. Merely words, spoken like any other. "Fiat lux!" he cried, his eyes lit only with terror. Nothing. Nothing. "Astarion, what did you do?" Simon gasped, his gaze flicking back to the tower. "No, I did what you asked," Astarion replied, panic in his breath. What did he do? "I did as I was told. I swear, nothing else." "Hey now, it's all right. We believe you," Karlak said, striding over and shuddering lightly as she approached Astarion. "Feels like ice over here." she remarked, looking up at the tower and to the inactive turrets. Gotta be something cancelling magic in that tower, I reckon. But it gets us inside without getting blasted, so I'll take it, she grinned. Whoever built this place must have had some sort of key to allow their spell casting and not others, Simon groaned, standing on wobbly legs. Fantastic security, he added, reaching down to help Shadowheart up. We'll need to be careful inside then. We won't be much use without our magic, she said, also looking quite pale and ill. Leave it to us, Karlak grinned, slapping Astarion on the shoulder and withdrawing her hand before her heat could pass through her gloves. For how cold the air certainly felt, it had no apparent effect on her engine. Damn good sight Gale isn't here, eh? Or do you reckon whatever this is would help with that orb in his chest? I'd rather not contemplate the interaction, Simon sighed. Please, let's hurry inside. I don't like the idea of something swooping down on us in the now defenseless courtyard. The four of them kept clustered close, huddling near Karlak for warmth in the now frigid air. The low arcane hum of the tower kept the space from being too quiet, but to Simon's ears the hum felt so distant, a vibration more seen and not felt. It hurt, being apart from the weave. His body and soul ached for that soft hum of magic. But not the ache that Simon felt when Astarion left him alone in his bedroll, or the ache of being away from hearth and home, of knowing how far he was from Vladimir. No. This was an ache like a beating at the hands of too many priests swept up in the frenzy of incense and wine. This was an ache like an infected tooth, an ache like a stab wound just patched with his divine magic, no longer bleeding but sealed with a snarl by a god longing to feed. A sharp, physical pain, enough to bring tears to his eyes as they approached the tower. The device that activated the lift was in the basement, Astarion said, his voice oddly soft, flat. Perhaps we'll find answers there. Right, Karlak said, ushering her small, frail-looking companions inside and pulling the double door shut behind them. Come on. Mama Kay's got you, she smiled, leading them like ducklings to the lift. It was a bit of a tight fit, all of them, plus Scratch in the chamber. It might not have been so uncomfortable had they not needed to avoid Karlak's flames. Shadowheart leaned heavily against Simon, her hands trembling lightly as she shyly sought his grasp, half expecting him to wave her away. It was no secret in camp that Simon had been spending at least a portion of his evenings in Astarion's arms. Even Withers had noticed. And yet he lingered with her after their evening worship of the dark, sharing a cup and gossip, only to then go to him, slip into his tent, stumble out a few minutes later with a bandage held to his neck. The pain was good, she told herself, holy, blessed, mostly dull, except for when their eyes met. So like each other it was uncanny. But she felt his larger fingers wrap around hers, the gold and silver of his signet ring heavy against her hand, and the pain stung again, sharp in her chest. Stay here, Astarion instructed softly, slipping out of the lift and prowling into the room. As Simon had warned, the floor here was unstable. The pile of rubble in the room below, visible through the gaping hole in the floor, was proof. This room appeared to be living quarters, if the bed and wardrobe in the corner was anything to judge by. Astarion crept through the shadows, eyes keen for any traps or hazards. It's back! Simon cried, his face lit by a tiny flame that he'd snapped to the tips of his fingers. Oh, thank goodness! Astarion sighed loudly. And here I was, worried I'd have to do everything. His tittering laugh filled the room as if he could will away the gloom as he headed back to the lift. What'd you do different this time? Karlak asked, leaning against the lift doorframe. Nothing, I just... Simon began, but as Astarion came closer, the flame flickered out, the same bone-aching cold starting to sweep over Simon. He winced and pulled his hand back, snapping his fingers again, trying to reignite them. With dawning horror and realization, Astarion took a step back, and flames leapt to life in Simon's hand again. It's me, Astarion said, his countenance dimming with resignation. I'm the problem. No, you have a problem, mate. You're not a problem, Karlak insisted. For now, let's focus on the positives. Positives! Astarion snapped. What could possibly be positive about this? I'm sucking your magic away as surely as I suck your blood. Where is the positive? He spat. It's not only my magic, Simon replied, his eyes alight with potential. You have an anti-magic field now, for whatever reason. Imagine, we get to Moonrise, some absolutist acolyte raises their staff, and nothing. No possible defense as you leap from the shadows and eviscerate them. Simon watched for the delight that so often danced in Astarion's eyes at talk of murder, but there was none. No joy, no intrigue, no hunger. Even the momentary frustration he'd shown just a moment before seemed to be disappearing. Astarion drew a long breath through his nose, his jaw clenched. Back into the shadows. Creeping. Slinking. Alone. Know your part and place, boy. A silent role for you is ideal if you aren't singing. If that is what you think is best, Astarion said, focusing on Simon. He still had a use. At arm's length, but a use nonetheless.